Sarah Ashvane had learned, a long time ago, that the safest thing a person could be was forgettable. She was good at it. Remarkably good. She knew how to walk into a room without touching the air. She knew how to eat in the corner of the dining hall without anyone noticing her plate. She knew how to say good morning in a tone so flat and so ordinary that the person she said it to forgot it immediately, before they had even finished turning away. She had been practicing since she was 6 years old, when they brought her from the border waste to Ravenspire and sat her at the back of a classroom full of children who already had names that meant something. She had understood, without anyone explaining it, that she was there because someone had signed a form, not because anyone wanted her. The form was the important part. She was just attached to it. 22 years of practice. She was very good. The morning of the claiming trial, she borrowed a dress from the woman 2 doors down. The woman was kind enough not to ask why Sarah did not have her own. Sarah was grateful enough not to explain. The dress was pale gray, slightly too long, and the hem on the left side had come loose at some point and been re-stitched by someone who was not paying full attention. It came loose again before Sarah even reached the bottom of the stairs. She tucked it back. It didn't stay. She tucked it again. The great hall of Ravenspire was full by the time she arrived. Every unmated wolf in the territory was required to present at the trial. That was pack law, and pack law was the one thing in Ravenspire that did not make exceptions. Not even for women who had no business being there. She found a seat near the side wall, 3rd row from the back, beside a column wide enough to make her feel slightly less visible. She noted the exits. There were 4. She noted the quickest path to each one. Old habit. She did it in every room she ever entered. The hall smelled like candle wax and old stone, and the particular kind of anxiety that spreads through a crowd when everyone is pretending they are not nervous. High windows let in the afternoon light in long, pale columns. The stone floor was cold through the thin soles of her shoes. She tucked the hem again. He arrived after everyone else. That was how kings entered, she supposed. After everyone else. When the room was already full and arranged and waiting, and his arrival could be the thing that completed it, rather than one more arrival among many, she heard the shift in the crowd before she saw him, a ripple of straightened backs and lifted chins moving through the hall like a wave. Then he walked in, and the wave settled, and the room simply became the room he was in. Calder Voss, Alpha King of the Ravenspire territory, and everything attached to it. He was tall in the way that suggested he had never once stood in a doorway and thought about whether he would fit. The wolves walking 2 steps behind him were large, well-dressed, and visibly expensive. He was larger and more expensive than any of them. He stood at the front of the hall with the easy stillness of a man who had never once in his life needed to search for an exit. Sarah had never understood that kind of stillness. For her, stillness was a strategy. For him, it appeared to be the natural condition of someone who owned the room he was standing in. The trial began. One by one, each unmated wolf approached the dais at the center of the hall. They stepped forward, and the head elder, a woman so old her hair had gone past white into something almost transparent, would place her palm flat on their sternum and read the wolf within. Strength, lineage, potential. The words were spoken aloud, for the hall to hear, because the trial was not a private thing. It never had been. Most of the readings were ordinary, strong, promising, mid-range. The crowd murmured and nodded, and occasionally, someone near the front made a small sound of approval. Sarah counted the knots in the wood of the bench beneath her hands. There were 3. Her name was called 7th. She stood. She walked to the dais. She was aware of approximately 40 things simultaneously: the hem, the floor, the cold, the exits, the particular quality of silence that falls when a crowd stops pretending it isn't watching and simply watches. She stepped up onto the low platform and stood in front of the elder and kept her face exactly the way she had trained it to stay: neutral, present, gone. The elder placed her palm against Sarah's sternum. Nothing happened. The silence changed shape. It went from the silence of watching to the silence of having seen something and not yet decided what to do about it. The elder's hand stayed where it was for 3 full seconds longer than it had stayed on anyone else. Then she removed it, and her face did not give anything away, and she said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "No manifest. insufficient. Sarah stepped back. She reached down and tucked the hem. A voice from the front of the hall said, "Is that the border girl?" Did no one look at the trial list? It was a light voice, casual, not cruel exactly, more the way a person sounds when they are pointing out a clerical error. A small, inconvenient thing that should have been caught earlier. The kind of comment that assumed the subject of it was not truly present enough to be affected. She knew the voice. Everyone knew the voice. She looked straight ahead. She tucked the hem. She walked back to her seat and sat down beside her column and counted the knots in the bench. 3. Still 3. 12 more wolves presented. She did not look at the front of the hall again. The closing blessing began near dusk, when the light through the high windows had gone from pale gold to something closer to copper. The head elder raised both hands, and the pack magic moved through the hall. It was not something you saw, exactly, but something you felt, the way you feel the moment before rain starts, a change in the weight of the air. It touched every wolf present in turn, a brief and formal acknowledgement, the final seal of the trial. It hit Sarah like a door she did not know was locked, opening from the inside. Something moved beneath her sternum. It was not pain. It was not even discomfort exactly. It was the feeling of something very large, which had been sleeping in a very small space for a very long time, slowly becoming aware that the space was no longer as small as it had seemed. She gripped the bench. She looked at her knuckles. They were white. She found the knots. 3. She counted them again. Still 3. She was very focused on the knots. The light changed. She did not know, later, how to describe what happened next. She was not shifting. She had never shifted. Not once in 22 years. And this was not that. This was something coming up through her, the way water finds the crack in stone it has been working at for years. It was silver and dark at the same time, which should not have been possible, and it was old. Not her old. Old in a way that made the stone floor beneath her feet feel new. Old in a way that made the hall feel like something that had been built last week. It moved through her, and it filled the hall. The head elder looked up from the blessing mid-word, and stopped speaking. The 2 elders beside her turned toward Sarah. Then the head elder lowered herself to one knee. The second followed. The third. Not in ceremony. Not the practiced, formal kind of kneeling that pack ritual required. This was the other kind. The kind that a body does when the mind has not yet caught up, and the body simply knows something the mind is still processing. The hall went entirely quiet. Sarah was counting the knots in the bench. 3, 3, 3. The silver dark thing moved. It left her sternum and crossed the hall, not through the crowd but somehow between the people in it, or around them, in a way that made the air shift as it passed. It moved to the front of the hall. It passed 20 wolves without stopping. It passed the elders. It passed the 2 men in expensive clothes who flanked the Alpha King. It stopped at Calder Voss. He felt it before it arrived. She could see it, even from her seat near the back column, the way his weight shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way his jaw tightened once and then released. He was not a man who showed things. He had clearly worked very hard to become a man who did not show things. He was successful at it in exactly the same way Sarah was successful at being forgettable, through sustained, deliberate effort that had become so practiced it looked natural. Then his knees bent. He did not decide to kneel. She could tell, clearly, that he had not decided. The decision had been made elsewhere, by something that did not consult him, and his body was simply already completing it by the time his mind had formed the question. For 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3, the Alpha King of Ravenspire was on one knee on the cold stone floor of his own hall, before a woman in a borrowed dress with a loose hem. He rose immediately, controlled, precise. His face rearranged itself so quickly that if Sarah had blinked, she might have missed the moment when it hadn't been arranged. But she had not blinked. The hall processed this in complete silence for a long moment. Then the murmuring began. Sarah reached down and tucked the hem. He crossed the hall to her. The crowd moved aside for him without being asked, which was what crowds did when Calder Voss moved through them, and in 3 minutes, he was standing 2 feet in front of her, and she was looking at his collar, because looking at his face seemed like a decision that required more preparation than she currently had time for. Up close, he was still expensive. He was also taller than she had understood from across the hall. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not come from laughing. His voice, when he spoke, was different from the voice that had called her the border girl. It was the same voice, but it was using itself differently. Sarah Ashvane, he said. He had her name right. Someone had given it to him in the last few minutes, which meant he had asked, which she was filing immediately under, things that require careful attention. That is me, she said. I owe you an apology, he said. Sarah had been waiting, in some quiet and deeply unfed part of herself, for 22 years to hear that sentence from someone. She was not prepared for it to arrive now, from this particular direction, in these specific circumstances. It landed in the wrong place, and it was too much, and she was still holding the bench, even though she was standing next to it and not sitting on it anymore. Noted, she said. She meant, please stop. The head elder stepped forward. Her voice was steady in the way that very old people's voices become when they have seen enough that almost nothing surprises them anymore. An ancient wolf, she said to the hall, chooses its tether once, sometimes twice, across centuries. She paused. The bond is not a mating bond in the tradition of this pack. It is older than that tradition. It is older than this hall, and older than the kingdom it sits within. She looked at Sarah, then at Calder. It is not optional, not for the wolf, not for the one it selects. Calder said nothing. His jaw moved once, then stopped. Sarah thought. He built an entire kingdom, and something older than the kingdom just made a decision he wasn't consulted about. She thought this without any satisfaction. She understood, specifically, and personally, what it felt like to have things decided without your input. The elders withdrew to the antechamber. Protocol required the bonded pair to remain in the hall until the formal withdrawal was complete. It was an old protocol. Sarah suspected it had been written for a different situation than this one, but protocol in Ravenspire did not make exceptions. They stood in the emptying hall, 2 feet apart, while the last of the crowd filtered out through the heavy doors. The candles were burning lower. The copper light had faded. The hall was cold and quiet, and very large. Sarah looked at the floor. Calder looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Sarah reached down and tucked the hem of her dress. It didn't stay. It never stayed. She straightened up. She looked at the wall. She was very aware of the 2 feet of distance between them, and the fact that the hall was now entirely empty, except for the 2 of them, and the extinguishing candles, and the cold, and whatever old and wordless thing she had apparently been carrying, since she was too young to understand what carrying something meant. Calder watched her tuck the hem. He did not ask about it. He would, she thought. Not now. Not tonight. But at some point he would notice it one time too many, and he would ask, in the specific and careful way he was clearly capable of being specific and careful when he chose, and she would not know how to answer, and that moment was going to be very inconvenient. But that was later. Right now there was only the hall, and the cold floor, and the loose hem, and the Alpha King of Ravenspire standing 2 feet away from her, having recently been made to kneel by something she had been hiding, without knowing it, for her entire life. Sarah took a breath. She tucked the hem one more time. Still 3 knots in the bench behind her. She did not need to check. Some things stayed, even when everything else shifted. She had always been better at surviving than she was at understanding. That had gotten her this far. She supposed it would have to get her a little further still. Outside, beyond the high windows, the first stars were appearing over Ravenspire. She did not look at them. She was watching the door.